Welcome to Signs of the Times. I'm Dr. Willard Regester, and today we want to talk to you on a continuing subject because we have the editor of Liberty Magazine, Lincoln Steed, to talk to us and to educate us. Today we're talking about this subject that he had written on for this very time in this year. So he publishes it ahead of time. I got this few weeks ago. But it talks about a global slaughter of Christians. Well, I'm going to talk about this morning, or today, I don't know if it's morning or afternoon, but I'm going to ask you a question because it's troubled me, and I hope it's troubled you. I see more and more articles from everywhere, every writers I've never heard about, that doesn't mean anything, but writers that come from different interest groups talking about bigotry, anti-Christian bigotry. Where? In the military. Now, these guys are giving their life for us, Lincoln.
Well, this is the latest spin on it, and it's had a few ups and downs over the years. Let me say something that very few people remember. I've heard preachers even take sermons on the centurion that Jesus healed his daughter, wasn't it?
Yes.
Or his servant.
Servant.
And then there were other military people that joined with Jesus or in the book of Acts. That gives the wrong impression, I think, because the facts of the early Christian church and its history is that for the first 100 years or so, anytime a military person joined the Christian community, they required them to leave the military.
Really?
So there's a certain conflict between a pure Christian faith and military endeavors, which is not to say that it's wrong to defend a nation in a secular sense. Obviously, as Paul says, the state wields not the sword in vain, and they have a duty to maintain law and order and to protect the community against outside incursion. Where it gets complicated is where we project religious values into the military. Now, what you're talking about is the latest iteration, and under this presidency, for better or worse, President Obama has picked on a lot of social issues, and secularism feels like it's newly empowered with this administration. And so the talk of the military now, and we're getting some indications that in lectures and training sessions for the military, they're warning them about religious extremists and equating people of deep religious faith as basically enemies, and to beware of these people, right?
Right. When they come home on our discharge, they're automatically bad guys.
That's very problematic, and I think that reflects a secularist viewpoint that derives from 9/11, the idea that we're facing fanatical religious opposition, in that particular case from Islam, but the line has been drawn quickly that any a radical Christian who demonstrates out front of an abortion clinic or a radical Christian leader in a country might take up a nationalist cause. So implicit within deeply held religious viewpoint is the potential for violence and for danger to the community. It's not necessarily correct, but it's being used, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that the different lecturers in military training sessions have made some rather bizarre statements about how they need to watch out for Christian fundamentalists.
Right.
And we need to be aware of that. A year or two ago, we were watching the opposite. If you remember, at the U.S. military academies, there was a cult of fundamentalist Christians where they were equating being a soldier with an American soldier with a Christian cause, and there was a general that got up and famously ranted and railed against Islam, that this was the Christian battle of America to fight against them. To me, these both underscore the danger of allowing religious sensibilities to get involved with military endeavors. And I'll go back to what I said in another program. more so than most Western countries in the United States, there's this assumption that we are a Christian nation structurally, and it's just not true. But the fact that so many people think this easily lends to the military sort of a moral cast that they are onward Christian soldiers. You know, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is great. There's a hymn that everyone knows. That's how they cast it. And you know, we had a case recently, or not too many years ago, I remember reading, where the chaplains in Afghanistan gave a pep talk to the troops at one point. And I don't really know what they said. All I know is that when they left that meeting, they painted on their jeeps, "Jesus killed Muhammad," and off they went. I wouldn't like, 18-year-old guys from a rundown area of Flint, Michigan, or somewhere who are not well educated and are in essence modern-day mercenaries. I wouldn't want them to think that they are moral agents to advance through force any religious agenda.
Right.
So we should simultaneously tell them that they're helping the state. They don't have a religious agenda, and remind them that in this secular endeavor, they're not to see people of any faith as the enemy. So it cuts both ways. We had a case a few years ago during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that it was discovered that all of the gun sights that were being supplied to the military had a Bible text stamped next to the serial number. It was done by a Christian company that believed that we were on a religious jihad against paganism and false religion. And when a few soldiers within the military noticed this and brought it to the attention of their officers, they were told that they were Christian soldiers and that this was a holy war against infidels. And finally, the government moved on it, and I think they've stopped this. And, this wasn't any government policy, but it was an upwelling of a view that's in society that the soldiers are sort of armed version of Christian, or a Christian militia to advance a religious agenda. We need to keep the military away from religious sensibility. And the burden that I have is more to do with Christians going into the military. Now, our Seventh-day Adventist Church, during the Vietnam War, which I remember very well, I remember my number, 243. I never went there, but it was a possibility for me. During that conflict, and going back even to World War II, it was an option for a person that was drafted to say that they would be a non-combatant, either a non-combatant or a conscientious objector, that they wouldn't take up arms, but they would answer the call of their country to help it in a time of need, and usually that meant they would be a medic. Very few people realize that now with the all-volunteer army, or slash the paid professional force, slash mercenaries, that's not an option. And yet many very well-intentioned Christian young men, many Seventh-day Adventist young men and women, go into the military, and they do not have it as a regular option to be armed or a non-armed combatant. They don't have it as a choice to go into the medics. They do not have it as an automatic choice to ask for Sabbath accommodation. It's not impossible that someone in the military might get an accommodation, but there's no procedure to allow for that.
Which there was when it was drafted.
So they've given away the conscientious objector status, and they've given away the religious accommodation status. And that should be worrying to our society, that we are forcing religious compromise on young people who either didn't know what was happening, or after they're in the armed force establish some point of religious conviction. Right. In the workplace, that's well recognized. If you go in to a certain job as a Sunday-keeping Christian, and then you become a Seventh-day Adventist a year after, that doesn't undercut your case at all, because you're now acting under, as before, a religious conviction. It's a conscience matter, and that should be honored. Right. So even a young person that signs up that didn't have a conviction, if a year later in their service they become convicted of some particular faith view and they want accommodation, they will not automatically get it in the military, and that's a huge problem.
What about the chaplains? I get letters from chaplains pleading their case and asking for a contribution to fight the case that's going to the, we don't know, to the court.
Chaplaincy in the military is an interesting situation. I don't think anybody would knowingly argue that we should have no chaplaincy there because, you know, the old comment that there's no atheists in the foxholes underscores that in a time of stress people need support for their faith as never before. So it's a good thing that ministers acting as chaplains can be available.
Exactly.
But it's a strange dynamic where the chaplains are basically military officers. They are agents of the military. They're not free agents. And you know, we've had interesting cases, for example. I forget which fort it was at, but a chaplain has to be responsible for any religious service, and sometimes a Catholic chaplain may be responsible for a Baptist service.
Sure.
And on this particular fort, there were the Wiccans met regularly, and several Protestant chaplains resigned rather than be responsible for that Wiccan service, which I'm not really sure was ideal. I mean, because their whole charter was to facilitate all faith expression, but they resigned. And unfortunately, our Seventh Adventist chaplain felt that he could live with that. We've also had cases that I've been told of by people in the know, this was not hearsay, that we've had chaplains in the Gulf, since there's a shortage of officers, chaplains who were leading boarding parties and military forces. They were acting as the commanding officer during an
military
interdiction.
officer.
Yeah. So, and that's the last thing that we want, to have a spiritual leader, in essence, taking up the sword like the Crusades.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
So this whole thing is fraught. That's the best way to say it. We want individuals to be able to practice their faith, even in a military environment, and the facts are you don't have the same civil rights under the Constitution as a person in the military that you have in civilian life. And so there's a restriction there. We want religious help to these young people, but the facts are that a chaplain is really not as free an agent as we would hope. We would want religious coercion or bias to be absent from the military structure, but we know at different times there's been a cadre within there that's been forcibly pushing a form of right-wing Protestantism, and at the moment we seem to be in the blowback from that now, where we've got a rather startling condemning of Christians and other people of faith as subversives. And we just don't want, especially since post 9/11, the military, partly by inclination and partly by congressional mandate, are being empowered to operate against terrorism within the United States. So the last thing you want are young boy soldiers let loose on society, and they have very prejudicial views against certain religious practice.
Now, is there any difference from your office in Washington, D.C., where you get information from everywhere? Is there any difference from the level of bigotry or antipathy from the Pentagon versus out on the field?
No, I don't think, I've seen no evidence from the Pentagon that they're tilting against religion. I mean, these guys are politicians as much as they are military leaders. That's just not going to fly. No, I wouldn't even want to suggest that sort of thing. These anecdotal reports are of individual lecturers at different levels within the system that someone's heard it and have spilled the beans on them. Nothing I've read is anything more than that reflects local bias or a bias of this commander or this lecture or whatever. No, I wouldn't want to say that. I do not believe that as a matter of Pentagon national military policy that they're moving against religious groups. Not at all.
Now, what I've read, and I've seen people be chastised publicly for you shouldn't have said that, You can't do that if you're going to be in the military, but those have been.
Well, this was General Boykin, got really chastised for,
Yeah.
he was a fairly high-ranking general, made some radically right-wing religious pronouncements in front of church groups, for that matter, which he should have been allowed to say as a private citizen, but he was not speaking as a private citizen, he was speaking as a military commander, and that was inappropriate.
So haven't they won their day in court, though? These, I don't know about him specifically, but some of them have said it was okay what you said. I mean, some judge took it under consideration.
Well, I don't remember the judge saying it, but remember, there's always, well, less so with the military, but certainly a government agent has a responsibility in their government role to keep a separation of church and state and not make prejudicial or biased statements about religion. But as an individual, a citizen of the country, they have rights of expression. But the military, you give away a lot of rights.
I was there, I know.
And I must say something. I'll get onto a burden of mine personally.
That's good.
I travel a lot, and it really bothers me as we stand to load onto the planes that regardless of your status within the airline, we stand back and the military guys go on first. Now, I remember the Vietnam War, and not well. It was a war that the country turned against eventually.
Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, the country turned against the soldiers who were draftees, and I think that was socially irresponsible.
That was wrong.
Yeah, and partly as an overreaction on that, we now almost worship our soldiers, and like all militaries, they do some things that are less than admirable. They're called upon to perform things the average person would have no stomach for. They even now and then do things that the country can't even defend, like Abu Ghraib and that. So It's a mixed bag. And knowing now that it's a volunteer army, these are not general citizens that have been conscripted and are uniformly serving the country. These are young people, and I know how it works. In the most depressed areas, the recruiters are larger numbers, and they're offering a living to people where there's high unemployment, they're lower education, not all of them, but this is the phenomenon. And so we become like the armies I've seen in Central America, little Indian guys I've seen in Guatemala, where my wife's from. Little Indian guys, 16, 18-year-old guy, he doesn't know anything about the world, and he's told to do by his commander. We've got much the same thing. We've got these young guys from the backwoods. They're not highly educated, they're not sophisticated. It's a good living for them. And they're being told now, as everyone stands in awe and reverence of them, that they are an elite group. That's corrupting to society, in my view. And I have children, and I know the worst thing you can do is if a child has done something either wrong or involved in something a little embarrassing and it's morally ambiguous. Worst thing you can do is saying, "You did a wonderful thing, son or daughter."
Right, right.
And unfortunately, all militaries are called to do things that under normal society are not acceptable.
That's true.
And we're endorsing them for it. And I think the Western society, Western democracies have a great tradition. That's why we have civilian leadership of the military. The military is something that we all accept from time to time, civil state gets involved with. But when you elevate it too high, you're like Prussia, or worse, you can be like Nazi Germany. That started off with worship of the military.
Right.
I think those individuals, they deserve respect as the soldiers in Vietnam did. But we need to remember, again, this is a society that has a secular construct. It was a society of people with deep faith, and the secular government was to defend the right of people to believe whatever they believe. But we should never project our religious views into the military. They are not the knights in shining armor advancing the Bible with the sword. No, I mean, that would be wrong anyhow, but they're not ever to do that. They're a necessary evil, if you like. And in the medieval times, the executioner was fulfilling the government's will, but he wore a black veil. He was not known by society. It's not healthy for society to elevate this inordinately, in my view.
So you're not too upset when you see, I don't know the word, some kind of verbal words from the headquarters, Pentagon, or even Washington, or even the White House, denigrating their activities because you think it kind of brings them back on.
What do you mean denigrating their activity?
Well, I think it wasn't the president that said, I'm not going to raise their money. They don't need any more money. They volunteered. It's a volunteer
Well,
deal,
those are political considerations. Everyone could use more money.
But because they volunteered, therefore they don't deserve. I mean,
I don't really want to get into it. I might have opinions on it, but that's not really that's between their employer and the employee.
Yeah.
That doesn't reflect on the societal attitude toward them. And the very least I will say, just as the CEOs of the US now earn hundreds times more than the average worker, that gap has increased. In the military, the same. The generals and others do very, very well, thank you.
Yeah.
And the military budget in the US is larger than any other country in the world. We are a highly militarized country. Yeah. And if the society has decided that, fine, but we shouldn't see it as a good. It might be a necessary thing. But I was watching Martin Luther King on the video the other day, and we need to have a social consciousness that's informed by Christianity. And is it good to have more tanks even as the homeless increase on the streets? I think not. That's what we need to keep. Rather than, we know I want to be against the military, but every society has to make choices. And we need to work toward peace and justice. And you can't have injustice on the streets while you're dispensing justice by the sword elsewhere.
Right. I mean, from what I see, any police headquarters could get a tank if they wanted today. What's that all about?
You've got how much more time do we have? I'll just, in passing, say one thing. Religious liberty is the first liberty. It's often been said. It's in the First Amendment, which also includes the freedom of speech in the press. But you can't separate religious liberty from all civil liberties. So it's of concern to a person of faith in practicing their faith to see an attack on civil liberties. And I don't think without any malice or much forethought, our Western society, and the US is the epitome of Western society, we've accepted an incredible diminishment in principle, at least, if not in personal practice of civil liberties. And I don't know about tanks, but the FAA have already lodged national flight paths for drones. Right. And the scary vision of George Orwell in 1984, written in 1948, shortly after World War II, when the communist menace was growing, or the totalitarian menace of communism was growing. We live under that reality now. Exactly. The eye in the sky watching us all the time. Every phone conversation, every electronic transfer, it's all being collated and sifted. It doesn't have to be done with malice. It just means that the eye is on you all the time, and that's not conducive to continued freedom. So we should be jealous as a society about that.
Now, do you, as the editor of this magazine, do you address that issue? The SEA?
Yes.
Over the skies?
Yes.
Do you? Have you, or is that ahead?
Yeah, we've spoken of it in Liberty magazine. I have an article by attorney Whitehead of the Rutherford Foundation. Yes. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I am.
His credentials as a right-winger were well established. He was the lawyer who took on the Jennifer Flowers case years ago. But he's been worried and more worried by our drift toward a police state that he sees. And I had him write an article that spoke a little bit about some sort of a martial law, which in the West, not just the US, we've had before. It's not an unknown phenomenon. Whether we'll have a national martial law, I don't know. I hope not. But there are certain things that we need to decide of ahead of time as Christians, as Seventh-day Adventists even. One of the things under any martial law, whether it's national or local, there would be a restriction on the right to assembly.
Exactly.
If there was a martial law, do you stop going to church?
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that there wouldn't be any intention in this or any other similar country to stop people worshipping, but there might be an attempt to restrict people outside the religious mainstream. It might be in acceptable churches
Right.
under a period of martial law, and you're not one of those acceptable churches. You're going to go to church?
Yeah.
You need to think about these things ahead of time. That's the side of martial law that I think, while we can't control it, ahead of time we need to think about it. At times of stress, because religious liberty is not proven good during the good times, it's proven during the bad times.
That's exactly right. Now, to answer your question, yes, I'm going to go to church.
Well, let me ask you the question. I don't know how much snow you get here.
We got about 2 minutes.
Does the church close down during a snowstorm? It always worries me.
Well.
A few times I've heard them say, well, they've even sent out a message. There's a lot of snow today. We'll have no church today. I think that's one thing I admire with the Roman Catholic Church. Even in civil wars and all the rest, the doors of the church are open.
Open, right.
We should always be ready to worship. There might be sometimes when your leg's broken or your car is broken, you can't get out. But certainly, whether it's martial law or a natural calamity, we should make every effort. As the Bible says, forsake not the assembly of yourselves together.
Exactly. That's true. Well, you and I and our viewers have a lot of things to face in the future, don't we?
Absolutely.
And I think that your discussions on some of these subjects, and we're not done yet because you're going to be here a little more time, should give our viewers something to think about. So with that in mind, would you close with a word of prayer?
Dear Lord, we have the promise from your word that all who are faithful to you will be protected in a time of trouble. And don't give us the spirit of fear, but the spirit of hope and trust. No matter what happens in our country, we wish it well. And no matter what happens, we need to depend on you because you will protect us. Thank you for this assurance. For Jesus' sake, amen.